Ghost of Tsushima was undoubtedly a classic. A wonderful story about culture, about belonging, about doing what's right, even if it means maybe doing a little bit that's wrong. Now, Ghost of Yōtei is a game that clearly understands the aesthetic and cultural language established by Ghost of Tsushima. Visually and atmospherically, it feels familiar, deliberate, respectful. However, while it succeeds in creating a beautiful and immersive world, it really struggles, in my opinion, to recapture the emotional depth, the narrative cohesion, and the thematic strengths that made its predecessor so impactful. So in this review, I'm going to break down what it gets right and what, in my opinion, the game gets really, really wrong. I review games from the perspective of, are they worth your time? And due to that, the amount of time a video game takes from somebody is a huge part of how I review a game. And at 50 hours in length, I really do feel Yotei doesn't offer enough for that time investment. So sadly, I personally cannot recommend Ghost of Yōtei, especially when comparing it to its predecessor. But for now, let's get into the nitty-gritty of where I felt Ghost of Yōtei went really, really wrong. At its best, Ghost of Yōtei excels in atmosphere. It feels like a sincere love letter to Japanese traditions. Shintoism, reflection, tranquility, and respect for nature are woven into nearly every aspect of this world. Simple actions like cooking, painting, cutting bamboo, or just sitting quietly in the snow create a strong sense of presence. You don't just traverse Hokkaido, you feel like you're camping there, cooking there, existing within the world rather than just rushing through a pretty backdrop. This sense of place is one of the game's greatest achievements. Combat stands out as one of the game's stronger elements. The rock, paper, scissors weapon system, unlike much of the surrounding design, feels like a genuinely new, smart addition, even if it never reaches what I would class as its full potential. Similar mechanics in Teen Ninja's Rise of the Ronin, for example, offer far greater complexity, while the level of depth you could argue isn't necessary in a game like Yotei. A modest expansion on what's here already would have gone a long way. That said though, I have to give a special shout out to the sword throw animation and the execution of that. I absolutely loved that. It adds a level of cinema to the fighting and the combat that I absolutely loved. Firearms, meanwhile, arrive far too late to leave a lasting impression. I wish they were there earlier in the game. I loved using them, especially because in my mind, I guess, in like my mind lore, it was like a genuine continuation of Jin Sakai's turn away from traditional samurai traditions. And I felt like the spirit of that was carried on through the use of firearms, and I do wish that was brought in earlier in the game. The strongest emotional moments in Yotei are tied directly to Atsu's family. Quiet scenes, placing fish eggs in a garden with your mother, cooking meals, painting with your father, or remembering lost parents carry genuine emotional weight. And that's because the player already knows the tragic fate of the family. These understated moments often land effectively, communicating grief, longing, and restrained anger. When the game slows down and lets these moments breathe, it works remarkably well. Unfortunately though, these emotional highs are spaced too far apart. Large stretches of the game lack narrative momentum, and the central revenge plot struggles to maintain urgency. Unlike Ghost of Tsushima, when Jin Sakai's internal conflict was present in nearly every mission, Atsu's emotional conflict feels fragmented. Instead of steadily escalating, due to the nature of an open world game, the story just feels disconnected at times. And one of the big reasons there, and a major issue, is that in this brand new story, with no pre-existing emotional connection, I felt like I never truly bonded with Atsu's parents before their death, and you don't really get the time to do that. Instead, they offer to drip feed you that emotional connection through the journey. Now, unless you mainline the main quest, I feel like those moments of connection with your deceased parents are way too far apart to really leave any lasting impression. As a result, the desire for vengeance never burns as intensely as the game clearly wants it to. It never burns as intensely or as urgently as Jin Sakai's attempts to repel the Mongol invasion. And the very few times that they actually do get some effective revenge-driven emotion from the player, it's way too late in the game. I had it at about 35 hours in. That's just too much time investment to even get a slight bit of urgency or emotion or feeling in the player. As a side note, I was playing Dispatch side by side, switching between these two games while I reviewed them both. And, the difference couldn't be more stark. I mean, Dispatch's writing is sensational. It creates a connection with characters instantly. You root for these characters. Yotei, on the other hand, just has very flat 2D characters. There's not much there. And I just felt it was just very interesting playing those games side by side and really seeing how one company can just write these beautiful, colourful characters, and yet somehow in this beautiful world, another company can just write characters that do nothing for me. Somewhere in Ghost of Yōtei there is a message about violence not being the answer to violence, but I don't really know how that really flies here when the enemy here murders children and hangs your mother in front of your eyes, and then you decide, oh, actually, they probably don't deserve justice. It just feels a touch uneven at times. Yeah, it just didn't sit right with me. And again, going back to Tsushima, Ghost of Tsushima thrived on thematic complexity. Jin Sakai's struggle between honor and necessity created a powerful internal conflict. The Mongol invasion wasn't just an enemy, it threatened the culture of Japan, their identity, and its very survival. Every act of violence felt justified within that context. Ghost of Yōtei, by contrast, reduces much of his motivation to revenge alone. Many missions boil down to simple kill ex-enemies objectives without deeper justification. This raises an uncomfortable question the game never really fully addresses. If Atsu is killing countless people as collateral damage, what truly separates her from those who left her pinned to a tree with a knife in her shoulder or a giant katana in her shoulder? Without a broader ideological or cultural stake, the violence felt a touch hollow, and occasionally unsettling in ways the narrative doesn't really acknowledge. The story establishes Atsu as capable of traversing the entire island alone, making the choice much later in the game to place her niece directly in harm's way feel not only unnecessary but fundamentally illogical. This moment is further undermined by the game's apparent attempt to manufacture an emotional bond between the niece and the player shortly beforehand, rendering the decision even more jarring. I gotta admit, at this point I kind of rolled my eyes at the story. I felt like they kind of made me realise that there's not much emotional depth to this story. And that is a core part, in my opinion at least, of a Ghost game. It was a big part of the first game, and I think that's what made it so special. And the ending where they kind of force this emotional bond and the reason for Atsu to suddenly have a change of heart about revenge, all based around finding out she has a niece, just felt a bit off to me, I'm going to be honest. And really, rather than creating the emotional depth or some tension, the sequence kind of just broke my immersion, eliciting a bit of disbelief from me, and at times a bit of unintentional laughter. I scoffed sometimes at what happened towards the end of the story. This all would have been so much better earlier in the game. Why they decided to create some bonds 40 hours in kind of boggles my mind. And this permeates into the side quests, which due to any real emotional weight or emotional anchor, all the side quests just feel a bit bare bones. They don't really have a really deep meaning to any of them. I still remember some of the stories villagers would tell you in Ghost of Tsushima and how they'd be harrowing or really moving, or there'd be a reason tied into the main story that felt realistic. It felt like, yeah, you could convince your brain that you were part of this world and part of this larger objective. Sadly, Yotei's quests just feel mostly just like kill missions, and boring ones at that. I do have to give some love to the Ainu mission, I'm probably saying that wrong, but the Ainu people were the local native people of the island of Hokkaido, and they were basically systematically wiped out by the Japanese government and the Japanese Empire, and I'm delighted to see that they were given a chance to shine in this story, and that mission is probably one of the best side missions in the game. Just on that note as well, I felt like you would have had a much better story if you based it around the Ainu people. It would have been a tragic story, but I just think it would have been so much more in tradition, or in tying, I don't know what the right term is, with the Tsushima story. And I think that really would have been a much better overall arc for Atsu as a character if she was, Ainu, she was a traditional people and she was fending off Japanese Empire. Maybe that's too controversial, I don't know. I know the Japanese Empire don't like talking about things, the Japanese government don't like talking about the Ainu people, but they exist and it's a very real thing. And there are a bunch of issues that rear their head from the first game, which you could argue they were in the first game. Why do you have a problem with it in the second game? And my counter argument to that is we're on a PlayStation 5 now. We shouldn't be having super stilted animations, jarring turns of the characters, weird facial expression. The AI should be better. You're killing people within 2 feet of another enemy. They don't hear anything whatsoever. They see a dead body, they rarely walk over. Things like that I would have liked to have seen improved, and it just kind of feeds into the idea I've got in my mind that this is more of a regression, more of a either stayed the same or it went back a little bit compared to Ghost of Tsushima. Enemy AI remains simplistic, just as it was in the first game. However, due to the lack of narrative and mechanical momentum elsewhere, I really felt like I felt the lack of AI a lot more. Maybe because I was a little bit bored towards the back end of the game. But yeah, it just stood out like a sore thumb at times. Elements that felt charming in Tsushima now feel outdated many years later. In many ways, Ghost of Yōtei feels like it should have been the first entry in the series, with Ghost of Tsushima feeling more like the sequel as it's more refined, both mechanically and thematically. Yotei succeeds in atmosphere, cultural relevance and visual beauty, but story, character motivation, side contents, and emotional depth all fall very, very short. I felt very present in its world, but presence alone cannot replace purpose. Without the nuanced themes, moral conflict and emotional cohesion of Ghost of Tsushima, Ghost of Yōtei ultimately feels like a lesser echo of something far, far greater. And like I said at the start, at about 50 hours in length, I don't think I can really recommend it. I'd recommend Ghost of Tsushima, the PS5 version, way over this, and I think that's a much better investment of your time and your money. So if you want a samurai experience like no other, go pick up Ghost of Tsushima Director's Cut on the PS5 and enjoy that instead. That's my take. Let me know if you agree, disagree, what your thoughts of Yotei were. I was so disappointed by this. It was one of my most hyped games of 2025 and turned out to be, I think, easily my most disappointing. So yeah, peace, take care, like, subscribe, please. Thank you.